You ever have a game from your childhood that won't stay buried? Not because it was groundbreaking or universally loved, but because you were connected with it in a way that really doesn't make sense anymore. For me, that game is Ehrgeiz. It's one of those titles that lives in a strange corner of my memory, something I genuinely loved, but also something I look back now on with a mix of affection and a kind of a raised eyebrow. It meant a lot to the kid version of me, and even today, it still has a quiet pull. It's not exactly nostalgia for nostalgia's sake, more like a reminder of when gaming felt kind of wide open. Ehrgeiz is a perfect snapshot of the late 90s, hands down. It's a fighter with free movement before anyone really figured out what that meant. A totally separate dungeon crawling RPG tucked inside the disc like a hidden side project. And Final Fantasy VII cast showing up because Square could. As a kid, that was all I needed. Cloud and Tifa were in it, so the game instantly lived rent-free in my brain. I didn't care about mechanics, balance, or genre identity. I just knew it felt big, bold, and different. Coming back to it now, though, I can see what it actually was. It was an experiment. It was risk. A moment where a developer and a publisher tried something because they weren't afraid to be strange. They weren't chasing trends or trying to match the market. They were just kind of creating. That's why I wanted to revisit this game, not just to talk about my experience with it, but to kind of look at the story behind it, the intention behind its design, and how people reacted to it, and what it says about an era when companies like Square weren't scared to throw curveballs. Ehrgeiz may not stand as a classic today, like at all. It may not have changed the fighting genre forever either, but it does represent something valuable. It was a time in gaming when taking a chance was part of the fun, and when the industry felt like it was pushing boundaries simply because it could. So let's take a closer look at where this odd little game came from, what it brought to the table, and why it still sticks with me after all these years. When you look at Ehrgeiz, the first thing you ask is, how did this even happen? And the real answer is that it came from a group of developers who weren't afraid to tinker with ideas until something interesting fell out of the machine. The game started with Dream Factory. It was a studio made up of former Namco staff, people who helped shape the early days of 3D fighting games. They'd already experimented with offbeat ideas in the game Tobal No. 1 and Tobal 2, so trying something unusual wasn't new to them. Dream Factory never seemed content with playing inside the lines. They were always pushing into spaces that big studios didn't fully understand yet. And at that time, Tekken was dominating the conversation. 3D fighters were becoming a thing. So Dream Factory wanted to build something competitive, but different. Instead of locking movement into traditional sidesteps, they went full 360-degree arenas. And it worked. It was bold, it was also messy, but it was them. The project caught Square's attention, and Square was in their most experimental phase. This was the era of when they were still riding on the high of Final Fantasy VII's success, and they had that kind of confidence that makes a company try anything once. Square wasn't just making RPGs now, they were testing action games, fighters, cinematic projects, and anything they could get their hands on. If you'd like to see more on the cinematic side of things in their experimentation, see my Xenogears video. Pretty good stuff. Anyway, so when they saw what Dream Factory was building, they saw an opportunity of a collaboration. It was kind of a chance to branch out and go into a genre they don't normally touch. There's a detail about Ehrgeiz that people sometimes forget. The Final Fantasy characters weren't there at the beginning. This wasn't pitched as a crossover from day one. It was pitched as an original fighter with a fresh style. The Final Fantasy VII cast came later, partly to strengthening the brand, and partly because, if you were Square in the late 90s, putting Cloud Strife into something was the easiest marketing move in the whole fucking planet. It worked. It drew attention, and it changed how people perceived the game entirely. But under all of that, at its core, Ehrgeiz was still a Dream Factory project, a fighting game built by a team that cared deeply about experimentation, a project that Square supported because they believed in taking risks during this period. That's how the story of how this strange little game started, and shaped into something unforgettable by a crossover that nobody planned at the beginning. It's part of why this game stuck with me so much. Before it became a weird little Final Fantasy fighter people remember, it was simply a product of genuine creativity. It was made at a time when that was enough. When you actually sit down and look at what Ehrgeiz offered, however, it becomes clear that this was a game that was never interested in being simple. It wasn't content being just a fighter, or just an experiment, or just a novelty with Final Fantasy characters attached. It was trying to be several things all at once, for better or for worse. Now, the most obvious piece of the game was the fighting system. See, Ehrgeiz pushed for a full-range movement at a time when 3D fighters were still figuring out their own rules. Instead of keeping combat in a tight, controlled space, everything kind of opened up for you. You could circle your opponent, run around the arena, jump over them, roll, dodge, and sometimes lose track of where you were entirely. It wasn't always elegant, but it was ambitious. Characters had grapples, launching attacks, environmental interactions, and moves that didn't always behave like you expected. Coming from more structured fighters, Ehrgeiz could kind of feel unpredictable. That unpredictability gave it personality. You felt like anything could happen, and that sense of freedom was rare in fighters of the time. Then you get to the part where everyone remembers. The Final Fantasy VII roster. Cloud, Tifa, Yuffie, Vincent, Sephiroth, Zack, and even a hidden appearance from Red 13, sort of. They weren't exactly the deepest interpretations of those characters, but they didn't really need to be. Their presence alone reshaped how people viewed the game. For a lot of us, this was the very first time we can control these characters in real-time combat outside the turn-based RPGs. Even if the mechanics weren't perfect, that alone made it more exciting. But if you go digging into Ehrgeiz, hoping to uncover some deep narrative, you're gonna be down there for a while. This game actually... Okay, technically this game has a story, but it exists in the way a loose scribble technically counts as a drawing. There are ideas, there are characters, there are motivations, but the game treats all of it like background noise. The premise is simple. There's a tournament, there's a mysterious weapon called Ehrgeiz, and everyone wants it. Why? That depends on who you ask and how generous you're feeling with your interpretation. The game never really commits to explaining anything, and honestly, that might be part of its charm, probably. Each fighter's got a reason to be there, even if the game barely bothers to tell you. You've got a treasure hunter who seems like he walked here directly from another Dream Factory game, a wrestler who looks like he was designed on lunch break, a ninja who moves like he showed up from a completely different game, a scientist whose backstory is only explained if you pause the game, walk away, and decide to research it on your own time, and then of course Final Fantasy VII characters who have absolutely no business being in this tournament, which somehow makes their presence kind of perfect. Cloud is there just because someone at Square said put Cloud in, and that was the end of the meeting. Tifa's here because she can throw hands in any universe and nobody questions it. Sephiroth's there, even though canonically he should be too busy ending the world to participate in what amounts to a supernatural backyard brawl. Yuffie's here because of course she is, and if you let her into one crossover, she'll find her way into all of them. Zack shows up like he accidentally wandered onto the wrong disc, Vincent materializes in complete silence like he's in the middle of something more important, and Red 13's inclusion feels like Square was testing how far they could push the limits of the PlayStation hardware before it fought back. Look at this guy. It's a gray Red 13, and they called him Django. Or did Django? Django. I don't know. Anyway, every character in Ehrgeiz has this offbeat energy to them, like they were pulled from wildly different projects and dropped into the same room without warning. And the game doesn't try to blend them together at all. It doesn't worry about cohesion. It just says, here they are, pick one, go fight. And that's the beauty of it. Ehrgeiz doesn't pretend to be a grand narrative. It doesn't pretend to have a lore you need to study. It just exists in some strange mosaic of personalities. It works, in a way. The story isn't the reason anyone bought the game. I can tell you that for certain. It certainly wasn't the reason I bought it from a kid for $50, along with a little bit of my lunch. True story. Anyway, the characters weren't meant to form some unified ensemble cast. They weren't meant to create moments. Little flashes of personality in a game more focused on experimentation and structure. And even with almost no narrative glue holding any of it together, the roster still manages to feel memorable. Not because it made sense, but because the game wasn't afraid to throw ideas together and let players figure out how they felt about it. And that's exactly how I felt as a child playing it. It's messy, mismatched, and slightly confused. But that's exactly what stands out. I mean, let's just take the opening sequence, for instance. Yeah, I told you, you weren't going to find any explanation there. But, despite all things, when Ehrgeiz finally hit arcades and later the PlayStation, the reactions were mixed. They were consistent, though, in one way. Everyone definitely agreed it was different. How people felt about that difference depended entirely on what they expected going in. Arcade players, especially those familiar with Tekken, noticed immediately that Ehrgeiz wasn't trying to copy anything directly. The movement system, the full 360-degree freedom, it stood out, but it also confused some players who were used to tighter, more controlled footwork. Some appreciated how fast and loose the game felt, and others found it messy, unpredictable, and difficult to read. But nobody walked away thinking it was generic. That's the one thing they did not think. It had an identity, even if not everyone connected with it. Critics had similar responses. Reviews at the time emphasized ambition. They pointed out that the game had tried to push boundaries with its arenas, mechanics, and dual genre design. At the same time, they didn't shy away from noting the rough edges, and there were rough edges. Some felt the combat lacked polish, like most of the Namco fighters. Others felt that the movement system created more chaos than strategy, but nearly every review acknowledged the creativity on display. Even with the critics not fully embracing the gameplay, they still respected the attempt. PlayStation version kind of brought a different kind of attention, largely because of the Final Fantasy VII characters that were included. For many players, the crossover became the sole reason to pick up the game. Some reviewers questioned whether this inclusion overshadowed the original roster, while others agreed that it strengthened the package by giving the game a clear hook. The dungeon mode added another layer to the discussion, however, as some players were surprised by its depth, appreciating that it felt more than just some simple throwaway extra. Others felt it was disconnected from the main experience. Same standard fare apply. But since my overarching theme in the last few videos have been risk, I think it's worth noting that once I stop and take a look at the quest mode that was put in this game, in the PlayStation version anyway, Fun Factory obviously wanted this to work, and they tried at great lengths to make sure every single mode in this game found some sort of calling, and it worked out in a lot of respects. There was the arcade version, yes, and Namco did produce it, so Namco was the one that would actually push out the arcade cabinets of, Ehrgeiz. So that's great. However, despite the lack of power and overall graphic fidelity, the PlayStation version surpasses the arcade version because of this quest mode. This thing was nuts, and I remember spending hours and hours in quest mode. Now, just to kind of give you an idea of what it was and what it entailed, picture Diablo, which is all well and good, but it was more of a transition between two different characters, and the goal was to go deeper and deeper into a dungeon, and then once you get done leveling that character up, you would go and switch to a counterpart, and you would use that character and level up. Now, the only differentiator between the two was the fact that you could actually consume items like food and things of that sort, and it would have certain nutritional value. If you start to eat a lot of food that only focuses on one nutritional value, once you level up, your stats increase in that department. Say, for instance, if you ate things with calcium, your defense raised. Now, you could off-kilter your whole damn thing, and if you ate too many vitamins or you ate too many proteins or whatever the case may be, it would level up one stat and completely zero out another by the time you reach level 99. Not only that, but after a certain amount of floors, you had access to materia, which you would unlock. You get to then transition between an ultimate version of the materia and a standard version, to which both use a consumable magic orb. The items that are found in the dungeon are plentiful. They run like Diablo did, so the stats would be randomized. However, there's certain key factors about the items that you definitely want to look into. Certain things that keep the items protected, and certain things that raise your stats once you use them. Hell, they even had a mini game where if you collected bottles of wine, you could hold on to it like the stock market, and at moments the price of the wine will increase or decrease, and you can decide when and if you were going to sell said wine bottles in order to get some sort of higher advantage, like buying better weapons or armor. It was well thought out. It was something that was not expected on a game that was just a throwaway compilation of various Square heroes against a bunch of randos. And I didn't expect much out of it as well. As I said, I had purchased this game from a friend who just gave me the game as well as the Brady Mega Games strategy guide. And the fighting game portion of this game was absolutely absurd in the sense that when it came to a move list, everything was absolutely decked out in buttons to press and timings to press them in. I had no idea what was what, and this is coming from a guy who played Marvel vs. Capcom religiously, as well as X-Men vs. Street Fighter and a few others. So when I got this, the move system and combat was nearly unplayable, to be fairly honest. But that one stray idea of a mysterious dungeon where you walk characters through and collect items and things of that sort was enough to keep me playing this game for months. Absolute months. And all because the gimmick side of the game didn't work out, but the newly fleshed out dungeon idea did. I think a lot of games are held to the same standard nowadays, where people will actually look to the game and they'll climb through it in and out, and they'll actually look deep into what the game offers and realize that some of the best stuff is not even the stuff they advertise. It's not even the stuff that was marketed or put on websites or social medias and things like that. And a lot of stuff is overlooked that way. Well, in this case, when this game came out, this entire game was overlooked because of how it was received. But even the people who didn't love it respected how unusual it was to see a full RPG mode sitting inside of a fighting game. It was unexpected, and at the time, that was enough to make it memorable. Now, among fans, the game has always had a cult following, not mainstream, not by a long shot. But it wasn't forgotten either. It sits in that middle space where people who loved it still talk about it decades later, and the people who didn't ever quite understand what the excitement was about. It's right in the middle. For some, it was the movement system. For others, the roster. For some, the dungeon mode carried the entire experience. Everyone seemed to latch on to different parts of the game. And that's really the core of how Ehrgeiz was received. It was never universally praised or universally dismissed. It was taken on its own terms and realized as an experimental game that drew strong opinions because it refused to fit neatly into any one category. People respected the ambition, they debated the execution, but they remembered it. And for a game this unconventional, leaving a mark was kind of an achievement itself. I may have had my thoughts on the game as a kid, and that's all well and good, but when I look at Ehrgeiz now, the biggest thing that stands out isn't even the gameplay or the crossover or even the odd combination of games. It's the mindset about it. This was a game created in an era when developers weren't afraid to take chances. They weren't scared to experiment or follow an idea just because it sounded interesting. You can feel that in every part of this game. It wasn't built to fit in a mold. It wasn't chasing a trend. It wasn't trying to replicate something already successful. It was trying to see what would happen if you pushed a few boundaries. And it's nothing profound, just good old-fashioned boundaries. What happens if we go in this door rather than this one? Dream Factory wanted to test a new kind of movement system. Square wanted to branch into a key genre they don't normally touch. Someone on the team wanted to hide a full RPG inside of a fighter. Square's marketing knew that having Cloud in there would definitely turn heads. It was a collection of ideas from different angles all merged into one project simply because this was the time when ideas were allowed to breathe. There's something important about that, something we don't see as often now. Today, big titles are built carefully. They're safe, with guardrails everywhere. There's pressure to perform, pressures to match expectations, pressures to avoid risking too much. And while that brings consistency, don't get me wrong, it also closes the door on a certain kind of creativity. The kind where developers throw something unexpected into a game just to see what players do with it. This game is not a masterpiece, like at all. I love the game, and it definitely tickles a nostalgic bone in me, but it's not a masterpiece. It isn't a forgotten classic waiting for rediscovery. It was an experiment. It was a bold one. And the fact that it exists at all says a lot about where the industry was at the time. Games like this remind me of a period when taking risks wasn't seen as reckless, it was seen as exciting. Developers were willing to make something unusual and trust that the audience would at least be curious enough to give it a chance. They weren't trying to craft the perfect product, they were exploring. And I think that's why this game stayed with me. Not because it was flawless, not because it defined a genre or anything like that, but because it represented a moment when creativity wasn't confined by expectation. When ambition, even messy, uneven ambition, was valued. When studios like Square felt confident enough to swing big, even if the results didn't fit anywhere neatly. Ehrgeiz is the kind of game that could only have come from that era. It's strange, ambitious, chaotic, and sincere. It's a reminder that sometimes the best parts of gaming isn't success or the polish, it's the willingness to try something different. Hell, this makes me want to just record some gameplay of it, maybe stream it. I don't even know. I'll see what you guys think about the idea, but in any case, that's Ehrgeiz. It's imperfect, experimental, a little messy, but bold enough to exist anyway. But I want to hear from you guys. What's one moment you looked at a game and thought, This is crazy, but it actually might work. Let me know in the comments. Shout out to everybody on Patreon and my YouTube members. Appreciate you guys. And especially appreciate every last person who pops into my comment section and starts a little discussion, because I like listening to you guys and your thoughts on the things I bring up. Hell, you voted on it. You love to see it. Speaking of which, another vote will be going up soon, and we'll discuss something else. Anyway, if you like what you see, go ahead and like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Take it easy.